privilege to be with you this morning, and so appreciated the ministry last night and again this morning. If you have your Bible, Exodus chapter 4, Moses is getting a lot of press, amen. And I was in fear and trembling a while ago when Isaac was preaching, but he just came right up and then stopped. That's wonderful. And so I want to, maybe even again this evening, preach on this same text, but this is one of the strange texts in the Bible. I can remember first reading this about 30 years ago, and my head was spinning. It made no sense because it was such a contradiction. God speaks to his man called Moses in one breath. He says, I want you to go to Pharaoh. I've anointed you, I've called you, and I'm going to use you to deliver my people. The next breath, the Lord met him and sought to kill him. You know, that's a little strange. But after years of working with men and couples and trying to prepare them for the ministry and being involved with those out on the field, the battles, the demonic assaults, the struggles, the failures, those who were once involved, now they pull back. Those who once the vision burned bright, now it's clouded. This text is no longer strange to me, but filled with powerful insight. I want to minister this morning on God's second call, Exodus 4, verse 18. So Moses returned to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, please let me go and return to my brethren who are in Egypt. See whether they are still alive. Jethro said to Moses, go in peace. Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, go return to Egypt, for all the men who sought your life are dead. Moses took his wife, his sons, set them on a donkey, returned to the land of Egypt. Moses took the rod of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. So I say to you, let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, indeed I will kill your son and your firstborn. And it came to pass on the way at the encampment, the Lord met him and sought to kill him. Then Zipporah, this was his wife, took a sharp stone, cut off the foreskin of her son, cast it at Moses' feet, and said, surely you're a husband of blood to me. So God let him go. Then she said, you are a husband of blood because of the circumcision. Father, we come this morning by the blood of Jesus. I pray, God, you would move in this place. I pray you would peel away flesh. God, I pray that every man and woman in this place, God, would be all you've called them to be. God, give us nations, give us men, couples whose heart and passion burns for the souls of this generation. Help us this morning, God. All you do in this place this week, it's to the glory of your name. Amen. God's second call. Here we have a powerful truth that the heart of man cries for cause and purpose. This is an advantage when you're pastoring, beating in the heart of every man who walks through the doors, many times their wives also, is this desire to be used, to have accomplishment in life. This is by God's design in creation. Man wants something to give himself, a place to excel, to be a part of something, to make impact, to accomplish, to conquer. I was speaking with a pastor this morning, and he mentioned to me, he says, the older I get, the more I want my life to count and to have influence for God. to make a difference in life. In other words, there's something within us by God's DNA. We desire, there's a challenge, there's a cause. We're looking for something to give our heart to. This is the glory of God deposited in the heart of man. Genesis 1:26, then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion. The image and likeness of God has to do with His nature, His passion, His desire, His spirit. We see this in the natural. I have a number of men. In fact, one young man, Bobby, a young Hispanic man, joined the Marines. We have several of them over in Iraq now and have been there and back. And I got a call just a couple of days ago. I was in Colorado Springs preaching Friday. He got wounded. There was a landmine went off. The shrapnel caught him, broke his arm, took off some of his fingers. His mother, father in our church. But there's something in the heart of a man. He likes combat. He wants to make a difference. They sign up by the tens of thousands. This is true in sports. They love the competition, the challenge, and the contact. Love to build things. But in its purest form, I believe this passion should be dedicated to the living God. This is what we preach. This is the power of vision. This is what captures, and our churches are filled with men. You may not realize this, but the religious church world today is run by women and filled with women. I turn on Christian television sometimes. It inspires me to preach. And these women are doing everything. And the few men you see are my age, or they're effeminate. And there's not many of them. But when you align yourself with God's purpose in the earth, to enlist, the Bible talks about God's army, to battle for the souls, as we heard last night, of men and women, to raise a banner of righteousness against evil and injustice and unrighteousness, to think that God would call me to be a mouthpiece for Him in the earth. This is a powerful motivation. This can capture the heart of man and cause him to turn away from everything else in life.
Yeah, amen. Yes.
Build a church. You think about that. This is His church. And God would allow you, as Barry said, to shovel their manure. What a privilege.
Amen. Come on.
Amen. The Bible's filled with this terminology. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, rulers of darkness, spiritual hosts of wickedness in high places. Fight the good fight of faith. I've seen over and over, myself included, wasting my life on trivial pursuits. I mean, wasting my life. 29 years old, wasting my life. Horrible father, terrible husband, totally selfish, angry, bitter, and yet come into a church, hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, say a simple prayer, and then the idea that God would use you, and something explodes in your spirit that is beyond comprehension. This is God's design. Moses has this kind of experience, this calling. He was raised in Pharaoh's house with the wealth and the privilege, the power, the future security, and all that would be involved. Some scholars say he was even being groomed to sit on Pharaoh's throne. But he saw the injustice against God's people. And something was triggered in his heart. Hebrews 11:24. By faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasures of sin, esteeming the reproach of Christ greater riches than the treasures in Egypt. For he looked to the reward. By faith he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. And so somewhere in this Bible conference, and this is part of why these are presented to you, and the opportunity is that God this week, that you're here, you're a disciple, you're a man, you're a couple, that God can do that. He can open your eyes that you can see the desperate need of humanity, and as you see them, something is triggered, that you're refusing all the trinkets this world offers you, the passing pleasures of sin, that something compels, and you turn from that, and you said, you know what, I would rather serve God, I would rather be used of God than anything this world can offer.
Come on.
It's a powerful motivation. This causes a family to pick up and go halfway around the world. Dan and Monica Ruby Amish, Bangalore, India. Young couple out of our church. He went over with me one time. I went over a couple of years ago. He was door director. He came back. He's building a church in Phoenix. He's got about 50 people. Disciples, had about 20 young men in his church. And he came to me. He's a young man. He's, I don't know, 27, 26 years old at that time. Him and his wife, she's a little Native American girl, and he's Puerto Rican, and they come, they have 2 children. Said, Pastor, we want to go to India. They just had a baby in India. Now that may not mean a lot to you here in America, but if you've been to India, you got to love that place, amen. But I'm thinking here now as a son, in the physical born, who knows what that boy may do as they remain in the will of God. This is a powerful thing with God. And so there's nothing more rewarding in all of life than to be used by God.
Yes, amen.
I don't have the vocabulary to explain to you what I feel even now and what I know this means when it happens in a human heart. He who finds his life, Jesus said, will lose it. But he who loses his life for my sake will find it. Has God done that to you yet? Because this is the difference. This is the line you must cross if God is going to use you to bring deliverance to this generation. You see, too many times we straddle the line. We want this call of God, and we feel the tug of this, and God pulls back the curtain a little bit, and we can see the possibilities of what God might do. But we keep a hand. We don't refuse and choose and turn away and make that decision that severs us into the hands and the destiny and the call and the will of God. Have you made that choice? Can God get a hold of your heart this week? Because without that, you will never be totally effective for God. God will only have a portion of your heart. And you will never totally lose your life, and so you will never totally gain it. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world, loses his soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For the Son of Man will come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and then he will reward each according to his works. This is all transpiring in Moses' life. But life is not a fairy tale. Moses makes a bad mistake. He tries to accomplish the call of God by the arm of the flesh. You know the story, he kills the Egyptian. He fails, he sins. He looked this way and that. And when he saw no one was looking, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Like so many times we think we can accomplish in the flesh what God has called us to do in the Spirit, or we sin, or we're disobedient, or we're carnal, or we're functioning simply on personality or gifting. And here he is, and the deception, he thinks no one knows. Let me tell you, someone always knows. And for sure God knows. The next day, as Pastor preached last night, and he comes and he's going to help these two Jewish men, and they expose him. Are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? But what's happened is he's made a decision in life that causes him to pull back. We're talking about a sin that either clouds your vision, moves you to half-heartedness, or removes you from the ministry and the call of God. This kind of sin has far-reaching consequences and effect that is not always seen immediately. You could be here, you could be a pastor, disciple, you're in ministry, you could be a missionary, an evangelist, you could be the wife of any of the above, and there's sins that if you're not careful, we may not see them, they may not immediately look to effect, but you sin, or you're disobedient, or you're worldly, or carnally, or you're fleshly, and what happens, it begins to stunt this thing that God's put in your heart. You still function many times, but there's far-reaching consequences that are not exposed until later in life, sometimes years down the road. I'm talking about when the devil diverts you. Listen, you need to understand something. If hell can't get you just to turn totally back in sin, go back crazy, wild-eyed into the world, he will try to remove your effectiveness for God. He'll try to make you ineffective, or he will try to keep you from fulfilling what God has, your inheritance, your destiny, your ministry, what God would have you do. He wants to, somewhere along the way, cause you to allow things in your life that one day he can detonate. I want to expose a dangerous mentality about removing your influence and effectiveness for God, where you're no longer salt, you're no longer light. Moses makes a common mistake now that's exposed in our text. 40 years he's been on the backside. If I'm no longer in beating this hot passion, perfect will of God, if I'm no longer fulfilling up to date what God has called me to do, there's a powerful temptation to begin to compromise. If I'm no longer in that dimension of ministry, why contend? Why pray? Why outreach? Why be faithful? Why study? Why fast? Why deal with issues in my own house? Standards no longer apply. This has to do, sometimes we've had couples come back for redirection, and it's interesting to watch them. They violate the very sermons they preach to others. Or it's interesting in the church and in the people of God, when they begin to, the vision clouds, or they begin to put on hold what God has called them to do, or they begin to extend it way out there in the future. When you do that, there's a subtle shift of the human heart. Your conduct will begin to shift dramatically. Why sacrifice the flesh if I'm not going to fulfill the call of God this week, today, this year. This is why people who preached against TV will go buy one. Movies become no problem. Where they go, what they do, their interests, their pursuits, what they give their mind to, all of this begins to subtly shift. Their conversations, what they talk about, what they discuss. They're no longer talking about what God's doing, present tense. They're no longer talking about what they desire to do for God, present tense. It's a dangerous, I mean, if it could happen to Moses. Men who pull back from ministry will no longer cut the flesh in their own house. There's a major explosion in this text, and it's over circumcision. Verse 25, and then Zipporah took a sharp stone, cut off the foreskin of her son, cast it at Moses. Surely you're a husband of blood to me. So God let him go. Then she said, you are a husband of blood because of the circumcision. You have to wonder here, why aren't these boys circumcised? This was the ancient standard, even to this day of Israel, of every Jewish male. This was observed in every Jewish home. Circumcision. But you see, when you're living in the wilderness place, it's not an issue. When you're living among the heathen, tending sheep, we heard this morning the trap, the snare, where your employment begins to be more important than your calling. When that happens, why cut the flesh? Here he is, he's herding sheep. The closest Hebrew is probably several hundred miles. And in his mind, nothing's going to change anytime soon. That could be you here this morning. And he makes some bad decisions based on the circumstances of the moment. I wonder if he doesn't have a clue this bush is going to burn again. He thinks it's over. I've seen congregations embrace this mentality. This is normally not the pioneer work. This is a church that's all on down in time. I've seen men and couples embrace this mentality. If you embrace this, well, it's over. I've done what I could do for God. Or it's way out there. It's almost be over the horizon. I can't see God using me. You begin to let things go. You're living in the land of uncertainty. Carnality and flesh begin to enter the house. All that we see is happening is in his home. When you embrace this, now commitment is a burden. Your convictions become extinct. You're no longer willing to sacrifice the flesh of your children for the call of God. I've seen so many families do this. When you embrace this mentality, now your desire for little Johnny is that he be a success in the world.
Come on. Come on.
Rather than a servant of the Lord. His sports activities are now more important than church. And it's unending. You begin to promote, and you know, sports aren't bad or education isn't bad, but all of this now begins to take precedence. Things are allowed to grow. What little Johnny watches, what little Susie, who their friends are, everything, what's allowed to come in. It's flesh growing in your house. This is also true in the house of God, Pastor. You lose vision and you lose that passion for what God can do in your congregation, in your city, in your own life. You will allow things to grow in the house of God that before would have never entered your mind. Now there's a different standard. But what's happening here is the destiny of these boys is being stolen. They could not minister before the Lord uncircumcised. They were not allowed to come before the Lord. Listen, you may think you're doing your child a favor by catering to their flesh. But in the end, you disqualify them from being used of God. Listen to me, Pastor. You may think you're doing your men a favor by sparing their flesh. But in the end, you disqualify their destiny. Just like these sons, he spares their flesh. And you never hear from them again. His wife, Zipporah, you wonder about her response. You're a husband of blood to me. Has Moses never talked about this circumcision to his wife? You look, somewhere in their marriage, she must have asked it, you know. What is this? Well, this is Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. This is our covenant to God. The Apostle Paul picks up stuff in the New Testament, talks about the cutting of the flesh from the heart. And this is our commitment. This is our covenant with God. And it's like, here she is, you know, there's years down the road. These aren't little boys now. These are men. They're probably 17 to 20 years old. Why wasn't this issue settled long ago? Men, so many times, they don't want to talk about things that are controversial in the home. Things that are pertaining to calling. They sacrifice these confrontational discussions and for the sake of peace. I read an article recently about the Omega male. It's an article that came out of England, had a lot in it, but one of the things is it's talking about how men are becoming so effeminate. And, you know, their dress, their style, how they walk, they talk, and the list went on and on. But it was very interesting, and maybe I can present this to you. It says, this is a generation of men that are always showing us their shorts and grabbing themselves. Could this be because they're not sure anything's there? They have to constantly be reassured I'm a man. Trying to disciple men like that. But what that means is they will not confront things in their own house. See, no problem with Moses as long as he's herding sheep. Listen to me, ladies. You can be the cause of your husband's spiritual death. I wonder how many men are dying in the corner of the church because their wife will not cooperate with what it takes to do the will of God. See, she's the issue. You can feel it here. She's resisted him. Here's an internal battle that's never been won. Moses in the tent floor, he's dying. and she's going off. Let me ask you ladies something. What has to happen to your husband before you allow him to be the man God's called him to be? I sat in my office some time ago talking to this couple. They wanted to get married. I always tell them, I ask them, I say, so what do you feel God would have you do? He tells me, you know, Pastor, he's a tremendous young man. He says, I'm called. I mean, I'm talking about a righteous young man. I'm talking about a man that's on the edge. And I want to go out and pastor one day. I want to pioneer. Who knows? And he doesn't have all the dots connected, but you can feel I can feel it in my, and I look at her. I says, you have a problem? Oh, see, I want to be by his side. And I mean, she just, yes. Now they're married and a few months have gone by. And she can't even be to Sunday school on time. She practically lives at her mother's. Won't follow up. People are too much a mess for her. And she always has an excuse when it comes to sacrifice. Here you can feel, of course, she's kicking and screaming. But thank God when the dust settles, there's foreskins on the floor. I want to say something. Ladies, it may not be natural, but sometimes you have to stand for God when your husband is dying and too weak to do what's right. I hate to admit it in front of God and everybody. There's been a couple of times in my life that Connie, my wife, I got a little crazy. You know, how many of you know what I'm talking about? I wasn't going out sinning, but I'm just a little crazy. And she's, what is wrong with you? You're acting crazy, talking crazy. Shut that up. Like, man, it's so funny when your wife's, you know, you wish you'd say, oh, honey, that was from the Lord. You've been hearing from God. Oh, I'm so glad I got a wife like you. Praise God, the Holy God. No, we don't do it. Well, let me tell you a couple things about you, sister. But we do go away and think about it. Sometimes, when your husband's laying there in the church floor dying, you may have to cut a few things. It's not natural, but if he's going to live, it's necessary. Let me close. Here we see God's second call. Listen, somewhere there's a burning bush waiting for you. And there's probably not a pastor here in the ministry that somewhere along the way, you just get, you get twisted around a little bit, or you unbelief, or you're laboring, or there's barrenness, or you're questioning things in the demonic. I've been a missionary, and I know what missionaries, the demonic assaults and the cultural assaults, and you're a long way from home, and hell's assaulting, and it's unending. And somewhere, but listen, I've had God come to me a second time before. And the bush begins to burn again. There's been seasons in my life. I was telling my wife the other day, I'm in an unusual season with God. And these are precious. It's like you can just feel God. I've been in other that I thought, God, man, he forgot where my address was. I've had those. Then Moses said, I will now turn aside and see this great sight while the bush does not burn. When the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, here I am. He says, do not draw near this place. Take off your sandals from your feet, for the place where you stand is holy ground. Moreover, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Moses hid his face. He was afraid to look upon God. And the Lord said, I have surely seen the oppression of my people who are in Egypt. I've heard their cry because of their taskmaster. I know their sorrows. So I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, to bring them up from the land to a good and large land flowing with milk and honey, placing the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, and on and on. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. I have seen the oppression which the Egyptians oppressed them. Come now, verse 10, I will send you. Right here, Moses begins to make all these excuses. So like us, we begin to build our case why we can't move into this next level with God. Moses immediately, he begins to disqualify himself. Men give all kinds of excuses why they can't engage in ministry, be missionaries, go pioneer, plant churches. It's unending. Mortgage, kids, family, wait till they're educated. I mean, it's unending. But how many of you know most of the time what we're really saying is not the real issue? Moses is throwing all this, I can't speak, I can't this, and I can't go, and I can't do this, you know. And God's saying, I'll give you Aaron and all this. But I wonder if in the back of his mind, he fears Zipporah more than Pharaoh. I wonder in the back of his mind, he knows circumcising his own house because he's allowed these things to slip for so many years. And oh, he's saying, I can't speak, God, I can't. I have guys call me sometimes and they throw all this out. And you learn in pastoring and counseling, they throw up all the flack and just sit there and listen and say,
yeah.
Boom, that's a real problem.
Yeah, man.
So here he is. Listen to me, husband. Your wife knows what you've become. You may still be behind the pulpit, but she knows. Had a couple in my office. Husband screaming, you don't trust me. I mean, you don't trust me. I mean, She looked at him. She said, why should I? You haven't been on outreach in a year.
Well.
Case dismissed. It's easier if we're not careful to face Pharaoh than what we've created and birthed in our own house. Preached a sermon a number of years ago, maybe I even preached it here about Lot. He took his wife to a place where later he came out, but she didn't. Listen to me, husband. Do not, in moments of barrenness or discouragement, or even if you've failed, or you've missed God somewhere, or you're discouraged, in that season, don't forget there's a bush waiting to burn. Because if you don't realize that, you'll allow things to begin to breed in your own house. It could be in a church, in the house of God, or your own personal. You'll allow things to breed that one day, oh, the bush burns. But you're thinking, I'm going to have to deal with all this mess I've created. This is sometimes why pastors don't ever pastor anywhere very long. And I'm not saying, that, God's God, God calls. What about you this morning? What if God spoke to you this week? Mexico, Africa, India, Australia, England, Philippines, California, New York. Oh, I'm not qualified, I need more time. Oh, you start. But the real truth is, Moses, in spite of all of this, on the Mount of Transfiguration, there he is. Oh, he didn't go in. I got a sermon I preached, The Man Who Died Too Young, but it's so unusual. He saw his inheritance. It's at his fingertips. But God says, I'm not going to allow you to go in. But on the Mount of Transfiguration, that's Israel. He's standing there. Listen, it's not over. It is not over. Don't embrace this mentality that it's over. This is all I'm ever going to do. You can be pastor, because when you do, there's a twisting, subtle shift of the heart. And things will begin to grow that have the ability to detonate the call of God for your life. I ask you to bow your head with me this morning.